The protests on college campuses that are going on across the country remind me of a protest I was involved in when I was in college at Florida A&M University. The thing that triggered that protest was the death of Arthur McDuffie in Miami, Florida. Arthur McDuffie was a former Marine and an insurance salesman, and he rode a motorcycle. So one night, the police said he ran a red light, and they chased him through the streets of Miami. They caught up to him, and they reported that he died from his injuries due to a motorcycle crash that he had occurred. They had a trial, and this was in 1979. They had a trial, and in 1980, the police officers were exonerated for the death of Arthur McDuffie. And it was ruled, you know, that he had an accident. Well, Miami exploded. Now, I was in Tallahassee, Florida, where Florida A&M was located, and people were running up and down the breezeway in the apartments I lived in, knocking on every door. So they let them off, and all kinds of expletives were being tossed around. So um, there was a organized march on the capital, the state capital of Florida, that is in Tallahassee. So I remember showing up. It was kind of breezy that day. Um, so we marched. We had our placards and our signs. Thousands of people marching on the capital of Florida. Things got very tense. Later on, we had an assembly at the university in a hall, and the governor of Florida came, and that was tense. I mean, there were state troopers everywhere. People were throwing expletives at the governor, who at the time was Bob Graham. I think he recently passed away. And I was just ready for a riot to break out at any moment. Now, down in Miami where this happened, Miami was on fire. They were burning. So tensions kind of eased after a while, and then it turned out that the police version of everything was totally fabricated. What really happened in a later trial, one of the officers, maybe more than one, admitted that McDuffie didn't crash and didn't die from the injuries from the motorcycle crash. They beat Arthur McDuffie to death with those big, huge aluminum flashlights that cops back in that day carried, and their billy clubs. They beat his motorcycle to make it appear that it had been in an accident. They ran over it with the squad cars, and they eventually had to pay for their crimes. And so this is, before George Floyd and before everybody had a camera on them, carrying around cell phones, because this was 1979 when he died, and 1980 when the trial first occurred. So now I'm looking at these protests over the violence and deaths of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and it sort of reminds me of that protest. And the same pattern kind of exists. Older people, the establishment, telling the young folks, shut up and go home. That's not how it works. That's not how protest works. Civil rights movement, people marched. It was against the law, some of the things they did. They were bad laws. Had water hose turned on them. They had dogs attack them. They had billy clubs upside their heads. Some folks got assassinated. Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King Jr., and others. Had bombings of buses going on. So the Vietnam War protests, and the ultimate protest, what we call the Revolutionary War, which actually was the first Civil War. The second Civil War, which we call the Civil War, was the second Civil War because the colonists were part of Great Britain, England, and they rebelled. So when you win, you get to call it the Revolutionary War. If they had lost, I'm sure Great Britain would have called it a civil war. So protests, part of the First Amendment rights, led to women getting voting rights, led to the Equal Rights Amendment, and a lot of the other changes that have occurred in this country. So we need to just think about when the establishment, the older folks, people my age, tell young folks, shut up and go home. Rewind back to when maybe you were involved in something because you didn't think what was going on was right and you took to the streets and protested. Hey, that's the way of the world, and that's the way of the United States, and that's how the United States became the United States. So, First Amendment, still strong. And sometimes people get to a certain spot in their life, and it's like, well, I don't want to be bothered with all that. So you guys just go to the house. But you got to listen, because usually in the long view of history, oftentimes those protesting come out better than those that were opposing the protests.